What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. And it is time to break down Regional Championship Charlotte. We're going to be going over the Day 1, Day 2 metagame breakdown, as well as looking at the top 8 and some of the top standings of the event. And let me tell you, there's not going to be much to look at because this tournament went probably worse than what we actually predicted coming into the event. And of course, if you want to see kind of some of our predictions and everything like that, I'm going to kind of try to address them as best as I can here in this video. But if you want to kind of go and watch a more detailed explanation of Regional Championship Charlotte, you can go ahead and check out the previous video we posted last week detailing the event and the things that you need to know going into the event. And that's going to kind of set the stage for what we kind of expected from Regional Championships Charlotte. And, I think it definitely went a lot worse than what I had expected. I assumed that this was going to be pretty much a big coming out party for the Teamer Breach deck and just the Breach variants in general. Of course, a lot of players just talking about how this is going to be one of the last major tournaments to play Breach. It's essentially, dead man walking, as it seems. So we're going to be kind of, again, detailing everything the best we can here, and apparently say our friendly goodbyes to Underworld Breach, as this is probably the last major tournament that it's going to be available in. And trust me, it went out with an absolute bang. But of course, before we get too deep into the video and we detail the details of Regional Championship Charlotte, please be sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you know when you can get notified of future videos. Of course, we do breakdowns like this all the time, pre and post tournament, as well as doing some other videos pertaining to the Modern Pioneer format or Modern and Standard format, and other longer form videos. So be sure to check those out, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Of course, leave a like on the video if you enjoyed watching or learned anything from this event. And of course, leave a comment down below how you felt about Regional Championship Charlotte. If you were able to only watch bits and pieces of it, if you sat and watched the whole event, I know I tried to go through and watch as much as I possibly could over the busy weekend. And, again, I thoroughly enjoyed the event just as it's presented, because I think Star City Games does a fantastic job of, hosting these sort of events. But, with all that stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the Day 1 metagame breakdown for Regional Championship Charlotte. So here's our Day 1 metagame breakdown for SCGCon Charlotte. This is what we were looking at Saturday, and there's a very big outlier here, and of course that is Breach. At the very top of the metagame, 23% of decks between the Teamer and 4-color builds, but I believe the Teamer version was, far more popular than the 4-color builds. So this was essentially the deck that we figured was going to be the most played deck in the event when we did our prediction. Kind of the next most jarring thing here is that Boros Energy, the last time around here when we were in Portland, of course we didn't have Aether Drift, which I think has a very minimal impact here. As we do see Blink, though, kind of go to second in the metagame, but I think overall, aside from Ketramos, there wasn't too much that we saw from Aether Drift. But Energy was the second most registered, or was rather tied for the first most registered deck with Breach at Portland, and coming into Charlotte, it is fourth at still 10% of the metagame, almost 11%, pretty close there with Eldrazi Ramp, and that's kind of what we expected there. Our top 5 of the metagame was also correct here, maybe not necessarily in the exact order, because I did say Energy was still probably going to be one of the top 3 most registered decks, and it was just outside the top 3 at 4th place. And we see Amulet Titan here, also seeing a little bit more of a pickup in percentage here. I think Amulet Titan was a very good deck to bring for the tournament. Of course, it won SCGCon Portland, kind of stopping Breach from, just the absolute perfect weekend that time around in Portland. And Blink, of course, getting to be a lot better now that they have Ketramos and this kind of value engine and things like that. So definitely a pretty good tournament to be a Blink player. But of course, kind of the story of this is the fact that Breach had over 100 decks, 101 more decks registered to it than the second most played deck, and had, you have to get down to the 4th most played deck, and it has over double the amount of decks registered to it versus the 4th most played deck, which was the Boros Energy, which is absolutely insanity if you think about it. Of course, we kind of take a hard drop off here. We lose about 4% going down to Amulet Titan, and then about 3% also, or excuse me, like 4%, but going down about 3% to Domain Zoo being the next most played deck here, which was very interesting because this is a deck that ended up looking very well in Day 1. We had gotten to see it a few times on camera, and it just looked like it kind of did its thing, when people are trying to play a little bit slower of a game here, where we know Breach can kind of combo off, but it doesn't necessarily have like the turn 2 or turn 3 combo every single time. Domain Zoo can kind of interact at some key points very cheaply, with also being able to put a huge amount of pressure on your opponent. So definitely it seemed like Zoo was a very solid take for this event. But as we kind of get into it, we're going to know that that's not really the case. You should have just not been a broke boy and played, or lady, or, whatever you identify as, shouldn't be broke. You should have just registered Breach, and it'll all make sense here as we kind of get on later. But Azorius Control ended up being another really popular deck here. Well, I say really popular as in, it was 30 less copies. So, you could double the amount of Azorius Control players. You still wouldn't touch the domain players. But we had seen like some miracle builds that were kind of floating around here the last week or two leading up to the regional championship. So that's kind of neat to see there. Mill seemed like another solid option. There was a former Pro Tour champion, a Lord of the Rings Pro Tour champion in Jacob Beardsley, who ended up actually playing Dimir Mill, and I believe qualified for the Pro Tour playing Dimir Mill, so that was pretty cool there. Orzhov Necro is a deck that we looked at this past week that looked to kind of combine some of the things that we'd seen from the black-white decks and, put it into a Necro-dominant shell to kind of further push kind of like the card advantage that you kind of get to end up closing out the games the way that Necro decks do. Mono Blue Belcher, a deck that has definitely taken a step back from kind of the spotlight here, where it was a deck that a lot of players played to beat Boros Energy before we had the bans and unbannings this last time around, and now we just have it at 17 copies in like a 1,400 person tournament. So definitely falling off there. The Oculus decks, Dimir and Esper at 14, Jeskai Control showing up at 14, Hollow One 13, Ruby Storm at 12, notable player, Young Dingo, ended up making day 2 with Ruby Storm and being in the thick of it for the majority of the tournament, 11 players playing Burn, and 236 other decks that didn't really register on this, very extensive archetype screen here. So definitely, as we expected, very top heavy here. We have 4 decks at 10%. This ends up being like some quick math here. We have like 23% between Eldrazi and Energy, 46 between those three. So then like 56, like 61 to 62% of the metagame was the top 4 decks, and then 70% was the, 5 different decks. And it's just kind of crazy that Breach really just kind of carries that number. I mean, when you look at that, it's like a third of those decks roughly are Temur Breach, are some kind of Breach variant. So I would say definitely doesn't bode well if you're a Breach fan, because obviously there was a lot of people that decided to play Temur Breach or the Breach decks, and it's probably pretty solidly out of the door here. But, that doesn't necessarily mean, high rates here. And what we're going to be looking at for the day 2 metagame breakdown is we're going to be looking at the percentage going into day 2. We want to see kind of the higher percentage decks come in a little bit lower, and some of the lower percentage decks come in a little bit higher. Usually it's kind of like to rein things in. You don't want to see decks that have a very high percentage also converting at an even higher percentage going into day 2. That usually signifies it can signify one or two things. It could either be a deck that just was like really good for the weekend, kind of overperforming expectations, or in this case, I think for Breach, if we saw Breach or even like Energy, whatever, kind of have this very high percentage, 23% here, and it ended up going even higher than that, and it's been a deck that a lot of people have been playing, then it usually signals something not very good. And we're kind of looking for Breach's number to kind of come down to have at least some sort of defense for not banning Underworld Breach here. So with all that said, let's go ahead and take a look at the day 2 breakdown and kind of see how things shook out for these decks. So now we have the day 2 metagame breakdown, and of course we see Breach have almost 31% of the metagame in its favor, 93 players making day 2. Isn't absolutely insane to think that this had a nearly 8% jump in metagame share from day 1 to day 2. We see Orzhov Blink, the second most played deck, also being the second most played deck in day 2 at 13.6%, also dropping down like a few percentage points. That's, again, kind of the expectation for a lot of decks, where if it's just kind of like a fair and balanced deck, I would say, from the format, not generally, like there is times where you could have a pretty bad tournament. Like Breach, I think if it ended up dropping from like 23% to like 16-17% even, I think that would kind of show that the metagame is starting to kind of tune more and be able to beat some of the more oppressive strategies of the format like Breach, and that's kind of what we're we're expecting to see and hoping to see, and that did not happen, as Breach, for the second regional championship in a row, has the highest, or the highest percentage of decks being played in day 2. I won't necessarily say the highest conversion rate, because that can kind of get mixed up with some other decks that we see here towards the bottom that don't have very many players registered playing it in day 1 that also end up performing well kind of in day 2. So next, of course, we have Orzhov Blink, 13.6%. Amulet Titan was our 5th most played deck, ended up being the 3rd most played, just ahead of Eldrazi Ramp with 1 more deck, and then Boros Energy a few decks behind at 8.6%. Domain Zoo at 6%, I believe that's a little bit of an increase, and everything else, I mean, Amulet Titan definitely went up a little bit, which we know Amulet Titan is always just a very good deck. It has been a tier 1 strategy through many broken eras of Modern, and something about the copy pasta, whatever. But, we knew Amulet was a good deck. It ended up beating Breach up quite a few times, and I believe even in the round 1 feature, we saw Primeval Titan beat Underworld Breach. So definitely a deck that's going to be on watch, I would say, and probably has been on watch for a while, but, definitely a deck that you get a lot out of for putting a lot of time in. Eldrazi Ramp, Energy, decks that players have been playing for quite a while and have been pretty decent picks in the metagame. Definitely not on my list of, rounding out the top 5. I just assumed they would have been like the top 3, but definitely players prioritizing a lot of the white sideboard cards, which we did think was going to be very good in this tournament when kind of combating some of the Underworld Breach stuff going on. Domain Zoo, again, performing a lot higher than, its initial percentage of the metagame, so that's kind of cool there. Dimir Midrange, I believe, also kind of shooting up there in the rankings. Azorius Control, probably about the same. Dimir Mill, I can't exactly remember, but like 1.3 to like 1%, a lot of these just kind of, having a smaller, metagame share, of course, kind of, I would say, what's the word I'm looking for? Definitely suffering for the fact that Breach, had like an 8% jump, and Titan having like a 3 to 4% jump as well. Kind of takes away some copies from the bottom decks that, just aren't nearly as good, aren't up to snuff for the Modern metagame currently. So that's our day 2 metagame breakdown here. Definitely some of the shocking things to kind of, the TLDR a little bit if you made it this far already. Breach and Titan definitely went up in metagame share. Everything else kind of went down. Domain Zoo went up just a little bit, but the big movers, of course, were Breach, which is a pretty big sign that this deck is probably one of the best decks to be playing in the format, that even if players are prepared for it and they're bringing in multiple upon multiple pieces of hate for this Breach deck, it is still very powerful, and that's something that we've been saying really since the first regional championship in Prague, I believe, where this deck just looked amazing and has continued to look amazing throughout the entirety of the regional championship season. But with that said, let's go ahead and see how it converted further as we kind of look at the top 8 and, of course, look at some of the other standings of the event. So it probably makes a little bit more sense before we look at the bracket and we kind of break things down that we just look at what the standings were at the end of the Swiss rounds to kind of get an idea of what our like top 25 decks looked like here. So yeah, we had the number 1 seed, Luis Salerno. I hope that I just absolutely butchered that. That was terrible. Playing Grinding Breach. Joe Leo playing Boros Energy. Jesse Robkin playing Grinding Breach. Corey Burkhart playing Grinding Breach. Brandon MacArthur, Amulet Titan. Jake Stein, Grinding Breach. Victor Hawkins, Grinding Breach. Christian Baker, Grinding Breach. Oh boy. So for those keeping track, that is 6 Grinding Breach decks in the top 8 with a Boros Energy and an Amulet Titan player. Now, Boros Energy being the 2nd seed, getting to be on the play for the majority of these games, good chance that, Joe and Luis would not meet until the finals anyway, assuming that they, were able to advance that far here. But kind of rounding out this top 10, in the top 10 here, we have 2 more Grinding Breach players and Eldrazi Tron. We have Ruby Storm, piloted by Mikey Bashara, aka Young Tingo. So that was the lone Ruby Storm player, or maybe not lone Ruby Storm player, but the Ruby Storm player that was definitely being followed a lot of the time here. And then we have more Grinding Breach, an Orzhov Blink deck. Then we have more Grinding Breach, more Grinding Breach. Demir Mill ended up getting a top 16 finish. Really sweet there. We had a short kind of going over the Mill deck, so I think that's pretty sweet there. More Grinding Breach. We have Kriska Oskapinski playing the Hollow One deck, so pretty good showing for Hollow One here, making a top 20 finish here. Jeskai Energy, a variant on the different energy decks here. Esper Blink 20th, 3 Amulet Titan players at 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. And then we have 24th and 25th place round out by Grinding Breach. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 Grinding Breach decks in the top 25. So over 50% of those players qualifying for the Pro Tour as it stands there. Playing Grinding Breach, and then we go down to 32. We have 2 more Mill players. Jake Beardsley was another player that we kind of pointed out, former Pro Tour, or rather Pro Tour Lord of the Rings champion. Another Boros deck, a Grinding Breach deck. Grinding Breach, and then rounding out is Orzhov mid-range here, with some more Grinding Breach, like shortly following, unfortunately missing on the qualification here. And look at that, Collins Mullen, Ross Merriam here, some RCQ, some SCG mainstays of the format of the scene, I should say. So, insane amount of stuff here coming from the regional championship in Charlotte, where we had a bunch of Breach qualify, a good amount of players for the Pro Tour. On top of, there's some mix of some other things going on here. Demir Mill, 3 players in the top 32. That's pretty sweet there. We did see, some Orzhov Blink, of course, one of the other most played decks in the format, doing some pretty good work here. Some other interesting things, we maybe have a decent amount of Amulet Titan here. We have like 4 or 5 Titan players in the top 25, so that's pretty sweet. Storm ended up getting a pretty good result, I would say. And I guess that's really it. We have like an Esper Blink deck here as well, so I mean that's pretty interesting. But that's our top 25, and then our top 32 really, and then of course we have our top 8 here being 6 Grinding Breach decks, a Boros Energy, and an Amulet Titan. Of course, we had 1 Amulet Titan in the previous regional championship. We also had a Boros Energy in that event as well, but no Eldrazi, no of the black-white or the Orzhov Blink decks, Esper Blink, any of those kind of variants there. So I mean that's kind of huge considering that the other most played decks in the format did not make it. I mean the second most played deck did not, qualified some players for the Pro Tour, did not get anybody into the top 8, and really just kind of a staggering and shocking 6 Grinding Breach decks. Now, to remind you that a month ago when we had Regional Championship Portland, there were only 3 Grinding Breach decks in the top 8. And we ended up only having 2 make the top 4 of that event, and they had to play each other with, unfortunately, Titan and Boros Energy having to knock one of themselves out of the tournament, and then, of course, Titan ends up actually dethroning the Grinding Breach deck. But, there's 1 Titan player in here, unfortunately does not get to be on the play, and they have to play against Corey Burkhart, which is a very, very good Magic player, if you have not heard. And then, I mean, this is just absolutely insanity. This is an absolute domination from the Underworld Breach deck. So just to kind of remind everybody before we look at the top 8 bracket, we have, most played deck in day 1, in day 2, an 8-point jump from day 1 to day 2, then 6 copies in the top 8, and we said like 13 copies in the top 25, and probably like 14 or 15, I would say, in the top 32. So almost half of the players qualifying for the Pro Tour played Underworld Breach, and there's a good chance that 1 or 2 players end up winning. Actually, I think with 6, I think it's almost guaranteed that there's going to be a Breach deck in the top 8, or excuse me, in the finals. So probably at least 1 person playing the deck also qualifying for Worlds. Absolutely insane. I mean, we had that last time, so really what Breach is looking for here is a win, and why not go to the top 8 bracket, and let's talk about how everything kind of shook out. So we'll kind of just work our way top to bottom here in the standings. So we have Luis Celerino playing Christian Baker in the 1 versus 8 matchup. And in the Grinding Breach mirror, from what I understand, what they had been talking about all weekend, was that essentially game 1 is just kind of a race to the finish. Like who is going to combo first and kind of do their thing. And it looks like Christian Baker was able to actually pull it out here. So the 8 seed beating the 1 seed on the weekend here, advancing to the semifinals, where they will face Corey Burkhart or Brandon MacArthur, the Grinding Breach versus Amulet Titan, and we talked about how Amulet Titan was able to beat up on Grinding Breach over the course of not only this weekend, but in Portland, and that did not happen as Corey Burkhart ended up actually winning the match and getting to be on the play against Christian Baker in the Grinding Breach mirror. And then we have Jesse Robkin versus Jake Stein in the Grinding Breach mirror, and Jesse ended up winning that one, moving on to face the winner of Boros Energy versus Grinding Breach, Joe Leo versus Victor Hawkins, and Joe Leo ended up pulling it out here, so we ended up having 3 Breach into the top 4, along with a Boros Energy deck here as well. So definitely no one saw Boros Energy being the hero at the start of the regional championship season, but here we are. So then we have Christian Baker versus Corey Burkhart, and Corey Burkhart just putting on a masterclass. Ended up winning too quickly. I believe the feature match was actually Joe Leo and Jesse Robkin, and by the time that their match actually concluded, Corey Burkhart and Christian Baker were already done. So, Corey Burkhart ended up moving on to the finals, securing a world championship spot, and at minimum $10K in prizes, or in prize money here. Trying to figure out if they're going to play against Boros Energy or if they're going to play against Grinding Breach. Jesse Robkin, Joe Leo, ended up being a pretty exciting match. I actually got to watch a decent amount of it, and, it ended up, faring pretty well, I would say. Jesse Robkin just fully showing like an absolute mastery of the Grinding Breach deck, and ended up winning against Joe Leo, who ended up having a pretty good amount of hate for the Grinding Breach deck, but just couldn't get it done, and, ended up taking a chance. Did not work out, and Jesse Robkin took full advantage of the situation and ended up winning. So then she punched her ticket to the World Championship, and of course, at least $10,000 in cash money. Also, kind of interesting as well, that Jesse was not queued for Regional Championship Charlotte. Ended up playing in one of the last chance qualifiers on the weekend, winning on the first one, and I believe up to this point was 19-2 overall between the last chance qualifier and the regional championship tournament here. Having to face Corey Burkhart. Corey Burkhart is a very, very, very good player. Definitely somebody that if you watch like the early parts of Magic, I would say definitely I remember Corey from like the mid to late 2010s. Of course, had been around for a while before that, I believe. So definitely a name that I've heard a lot in competitive Magic and towards the top tables of competitive Magic at like the Grand Prix level and of course the Pro Tour level and things like that. So definitely not an easy task for Jesse Robkin here. And of course, being a Grinding Breach mirror, so definitely Grinding Breach again having the best weekend possible. Aside from having a total 8 of 8 top 8, putting 6 in the top 8, 3 of 4 in the quarterfinals, and of course a mirror match in the finals, unavoidable. And Jesse Robkin ended up taking it down, and it was super exciting because this is like the first time in a while I can remember, a female, like a she/her actually winning a major tournament, and that is just a huge thing, and not only that, playing the best deck and playing it absolutely masterfully compared to like all these other great players that we've seen that are like picking up and playing, this deck and everything like that, just showing that like just proving to be way better and being a person that came up with the deck itself when Underworld Breach was spoiled way back when, and just kind of going through and fine tuning and just doing all the things to just kind of keep propelling this deck forward. So congratulations to Jesse Robkin, and of course congratulations to all the other top 8 competitors. But a very, very special congratulations to Jesse, just getting to live the full dream of qualifying at the very last possible moment for this big tournament, and then turning that into $20,000, a Pro Tour invite, a World Championship invite, and of course an invite to the next set of regional championships taking place, I believe, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Hartford, Connecticut. So definitely a fantastic tournament and a legendary run, to say the very least, for a player that I guess I don't know if the joke is like that they were retired or whatever, but like that this is definitely a good way of not being retired, is getting to play in probably one of the biggest tournaments of the year in the World Championship, and again having just such a legendary run and a story that is going to and should be carried for quite a long time in the competitive space of Magic. But yeah, that's going to be the wrap up for the top 8 bracket. Let's go ahead and finish up with some final thoughts here and wrap up Regional Championship Charlotte. So to kind of give my overall thoughts of SCGCon Charlotte / Regional Championship Charlotte, I think the event was absolutely great. We had Jim Davis step into the booth, where we usually see Ailey kind of paired with Corey. This time we saw Jim, and I think Jim was a pretty good commentator, being kind of his first time in the booth, and I was very entertained by both commentating duos. I think that, Mason Clark and Carmen Clomparents have a very good pairing together, and just, are equal parts funny and very knowledgeable when it comes to the games and kind of breaking down some of the situations that we kind of see going on here. And of course, I think Corey and Jim did a fantastic job as well. So I think the presentation was good. I think that while the metagame kind of seemed like it was pretty kind of bleh, given all the kind of grinding breach running around, of course, all the other, basically 2 or 3 decks that were, way above kind of everything else. They did a very good job of showing matches that weren't just, team or breach mirrors. We got a pretty good mix of like breach versus X and then, X versus Y. So I think overall it ended up working out very well from at least a viewer's perspective. And from a competitive player's perspective, if you have a major tournament that you absolutely want to qualify for something or are playing for something major and you're playing Modern, it's time to pick up Team or Breach. I would say it would be, not investment advice, but personally a bad investment if you have like none of these cards here, because it's like a $1,600, $1,700, $1,800 deck. So I wouldn't necessarily do that, but I think if you're someone who is playing Breach or have the capability of playing Breach, whatever tournament you're going to, just go and play it, because while this deck is legal, it is clearly far and away better than anything else that is able to be played in the format. I think if you're looking for a deck to kind of play towards the future, because, again, we're basically assuming Breach is a dead man walking, that I would say that maybe some of the black-white mid-range might be a pretty safe investment. Again, not investment advice, but a pretty safe deck to kind of pick up and start to learn how to play. Boros Energy, assuming that nothing else kind of gets banned, and that's kind of what we just expect is like Underworld Breach and maybe something else here. Like Boros Energy is probably just a solid deck to pick up and play. The Eldrazi deck as well ends up being a pretty decent deck to kind of pick up and play. So really, like the very top of the metagame is going to be thoroughly shaken up. It's just going to depends on how deep our ban and restrict announcement is going to cut. And of course, we're going to have some more predictions as we kind of get closer to the actual ban announcement, and we kind of get some more information of the Modern format, because we're still going to have online events and stuff going on, and of course other local tournaments. So that'll kind of give us a pretty good idea of maybe what players are looking towards playing in a maybe a post-ban world, or maybe how players are going to attack the metagame as of right now to kind of rein in grinding Breach. But I think at this point, it's pretty safe to say that Breach is going to get the axe, and it's going to end up being that, and we're just going to kind of sit and wait and see if Boros Energy can kind of reclaim the top spot of the metagame, or, at this point, do people kind of understand kind of the Boros Energy like MO here and end up being able to kind of keep that deck in check while also having some other risers to the metagame. So it's going to be pretty interesting to see what happens in the next ban and restricted announcement. It's going to be excited to see the next chapter of the Modern format, of course, as we gear up for the regional championship qualifiers that will be featuring the Modern format to qualify for either, I believe, the next set of regional championships after Minneapolis and Hartford, Connecticut. So be on the lookout for that. Of course, we're going to be attacking all the stuff that goes on for the Modern metagame, and of course looking at the regional championships that will be featuring the standard format, as we have done in previous seasons of the regional championship and regional championship qualifying season. So if that's something that interests you and you want to be aware of all that stuff and you kind of want to know what to play in those metagames, things like that, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, all that fun stuff. Leave a like on the video if you learned something, or if you just enjoyed kind of the breakdown. I'm trying to figure out kind of the exact system I want to tackle, kind of these breakdowns, as well as setting up some of the things you need to know for those events. So if you have any suggestions, comments, concerns, anything like that, please be sure to leave them in the comment section down below. But that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all in the next one.